My name's Joe. My pronouns are he, him, just so you know how to refer to me. I'm the LGBT trainer for the Norfolk LGBT project. I'll introduce myself a little bit about my background. I've got background in HIV clinical outreach and prevention, sexual health, working with trans youth and trans adults in Soho as well. Also educational background in doing these trainings, particularly first in London and now all across Norfolk. So we offer a schools award, a workplace award. We offer specialist training as well for domestic abuse settings and also for fostering services and healthcare. We run youth groups. So we've got an under 13s group and an over 13s group as well. We run a variety of adult social and support groups. They're all taking place via Zoom right now, as you might imagine. We also run a low-cost counselling service for people living in Norfolk. And importantly, our services don't have an age limit. So we work with individuals. Our youngest is 4 and our oldest is 84, just came out as gay last year. So we work all across individuals, and we just work with whatever you need from us. We'll never tell you sort of what support you need, but we'll wait for you to tell us how we can best support you. So now I'm going to start talking about LGBT rights in the UK. Just so you know, this can be a particularly emotive topic for some. So if you do need a break, that's absolutely fine. Just turn your camera off, your microphone off. You've done that already, that's great. But just take a few breaths, make a cup of tea. I won't mind, I will completely understand. Also, please bear in mind that some of the language that I am going to use might be reflective of what's used in legislation and not particularly in the language that we use today. So I'm going to start in the 1950s. Prior to this, gay relationships have historically been criminalised in the UK of some form since about 1533 under the time of Henry VIII. It was the Boucher Amendment of 1885. That was what both Oscar Wilde and Alan Turing were convicted under. And it's quite a famous amendment. But it was the Wolfenden Committee that was set up in 1954 to consider the UK law relating to homosexual offences. And this basically recommended that gay male relationships essentially be uncriminalised, finding that homosexuality cannot legitimately be regarded as a disease because in many cases, it's the only symptom is not compatible with full mental health in other respects. Lesbian relationships, importantly, were never formally criminalized, but this does not mean that they were accepted. In fact, they were often sort of really medicalized and really pathologized, and you might end up in sort of a mental institution. You might end up being sort of the result of a doctor's experiment. People were very interested in lesbian sexuality, but as I say, it was never sort of criminalized in the same way. Really importantly, when we think about all of these laws, on every slide, I do want you to consider the impact of not having these rights and what that might look like for some people. So for example, I want you to remember that George Montague, a 93-year-old activist, handed a petition into 10 Downing Street for calling for an apology from the government to the estimated 65,000 gay and bisexual men who were convicted under previous sexual offences laws. You can now apply for an official pardon. However, the process is actually particularly bureaucratic, and so only 350 have applied to do so, and only 83 people have been successful. Hundreds of gay men still hold criminal records from this period who are alive today. It's really important to remember when we consider LGBT history, the impact on those who are still around and who still have this history attached to them, and the stigma of their identities of that time is something that they bring with them in their lives, and they may have a lot of difficulty from this particular period. We then move on to the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalised gay male relationships over the age of 21. Quite importantly, we don't really see the age of consent equalising out until much, much later. It doesn't extend to the Merchant Navy or to the Armed Forces or Scotland or Ireland, the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man, where consensual sex between two adult men did remain illegal. It was in '69 that the Stonewall riot occurred in the US, and obviously this is a really key date for LGBT liberation. It kickstarted the liberation movements both in the US and in the UK, though activists were pioneering change long before this as well. In 1970s, we had the first Pride marches. I don't know if anyone's been to Pride in London, but the first one, 2,000 people marched. They're much bigger than that now. So we've got Brighton Pride again a couple of years later. It was actually the Liberal Democrats who became the first political party to support gay rights, not the Labour or Conservatives. They agreed that they were for the age of consent to be made legal in 1975. And a couple of years later, the first trade union congress was set up. And this essentially was to discuss workplace equality, which wasn't in place then. So essentially, up until this point, you could be dismissed from your job if you were found to be gay or lesbian or bisexual. If your sexuality or gender identity came into work, then that would be something that would be quite often an instant dismissal. Many people were sympathetic, but it was a huge problem for a lot of individuals. In the 1980s, we've then got Scotland legalising the age of consent. And of course, synonymous with the 1980s and LGBT identity is AIDS and the impact of that epidemic on entire communities. It was actually in sort of 1881, there was a landmark case that then meant that Northern Ireland also decriminalised gay male relationships. We then have gay and bi men place a lifetime ban on blood donation, despite the fact HIV can infect anyone. Does anyone want to hazard a guess at what year you think that was changed? Just type it in the chat box. Have a go. Thanks, Grace. So yeah, it's really, really recent. So the lifetime ban, it was in place until 2011, and that was lowered to around 1 year's assessment. But as I say, I used to work in HIV prevention. And one of the things that is really important around this is that because so many gay men lost partners and friends, blood donating and donating blood is really important to them. They want to be able to do it. It's very important that they want to be able to help others out. And of course, the sort of extra restrictions on them are only due to stigma and not actually due to any sort of sexual practices. So it's actually summer this year, there will be a new policy on blood donation, and that will be associated with sexual practices only, regardless of sexuality, as it should be, and that will come into practice later in the year. So I'm going to cover a key one now, which is Section 28, which is really important for education. Does anyone know a little bit about Section 28? We heard about that one before. Again, you can unmute yourselves. You can let me know in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. So Section 28 was in place from 1988 to 2003, and it was introduced by Margaret Thatcher. The Act stated that a local authority shouldn't intentionally promote homosexuality. I'm not sure what promoting homosexuality looks like, but it was banned. That's what was banned. Also promoting the teaching of maintaining, in any maintained school, of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretend family relationship. So basically, you know, people with LGBT parents, with LGBT children, none of this would have been discussed, and people wouldn't see themselves reflected in the education systems that they were going through. So this is something that was first attempted to be repealed in 2000, a bill introduced by the Labour government, but this was actually defeated in the House of Lords. And notably, then Shadow Secretary Theresa May called the bill's defeat a victory for common sense. During this time, much homophobia was actually actively printed in the media. So it was something that you would see a lot under the sort of guise of there would be a lot of coverage, as I say, about sort of LGBT identities, particularly under the direction of you know, looking at AIDS in the media. But what would happen as a result of this is there would be an atmosphere of social moral panic that was designed, that was built up. And the stories that were designed, they were focused on protecting spaces from predators, the safety of children, and the influence of homosexuality. Now, I just want to ask whether you see any parallels with contemporary media coverage of transgender people focused on protecting spaces from predators, the safety of children, and the influence of transgender identities. If you see any parallels, then it's something to be aware of, because at the time when these sort of media stories were happening, that's when some sort of harsher legislation came in. So it's really important to bear in mind the impact of what that might have on our social ideas about gender and sexuality as well. Then in the 1990s to the 2000s, we've got homosexuality was decriminalized in Jersey. Then you had the age of consent lowered, homosexuality decriminalized in the Isle of Man. The UK recognises same-sex partners. We have the lift of the military ban for lesbian, gay and bisexual men and women. And then in 2001, we have the age of consent gets lowered to 16, finally the same as heterosexual individuals. In 2002, we have the equal right to adopt, and that is granted to same-sex couples as well. In the sort of 2010s, the key piece of legislation that is really important that everyone knows about is the Equality Act 2010. It's the current and most important piece of equality legislation in place today. We've got 9 protected characteristics, including sexual orientation and that of gender reassignment. It also covers those who are perceived and those who have associated characteristics. So perceived, that might mean, say for example, I'm going to use a slur, but say for example, you get continually harassed and called, going to use a slur, a faggot at work, but you are a straight man, you are not a gay man. If that is the case, you are still protected under this act. Also, it covers those who are associated with these characteristics. So for example, you're a parent or a friend of someone who is LGBT and you're receiving homophobia, biphobia or transphobia on their behalf, you're also protected under this act. You're protected from direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment, and victimization as well. Though its original wording doesn't say so, also a recent court ruling suggested that non-binary identities are also covered under this act, at least when it comes to regarding employment discrimination. So quite often what happens with laws is the wording of them themselves doesn't get updated, but the interpretation of them does. And when it comes to, as I say, the Equality Act 2010, let's look at what this actually means, because like laws can be quite difficult to interpret if they're just there. So in practice, this actually looks like you have a right to privacy. So your identity is protected information under normal data protection as well. Your school and other authorities, however, can't pass on information to their colleagues, to other staff members, or to other students about your LGBT identity without your consent, unless it's a safeguarding issue. So if they're worried about your well-being, or if they're worried about yourself, or your relationship with someone else, then they might sort of talk to you and say, okay, I'm going to have to pass on this information, but actually you are in charge of when you come out and who you come out to and when. Outing someone non-consensually can constitute a criminal offence, especially regarding transgender people with a GRC. If you have a GRC, you can actually face a fine of up to £5,000, and that's not as an institution, that's as an individual. So it's really important to know this legislation is in place and that protections are in place for sexuality and for gender identity as well, so that we can advocate for ourselves. Another good example is that school uniforms must offer a gender-neutral option if requested. Just as no workplace can formally force a man or a woman to dress in a particularly gendered way at school, we also treat students exactly the same way because we're preparing them for the workplace. This doesn't mean schools can't imply a school uniform. Of course they can. There just must be a gender-neutral option. You're also protected from hate speech against you, your friends, your family, and you're legally allowed to challenge anything that you think might put you at a significant disadvantage because of your gender identity or sexual orientation. For example, non-inclusive hiring policies, such as maybe there's paternity or maternity leave that doesn't cover same-sex couples, and from harassment as well. So this is really, really important, probably the key thing that will be most relevant to you in your educational experiences and your later work experiences as well. When it comes to, as I say, when it comes to the interpretation of the Equality Act, it does vary. I would always recommend not going a legal route initially, but trying to make sure that things are dealt with internally on a one-to-one basis in sort of normal conflict resolution ways. But it's really useful to know that legislation is there if things do need to be taken further. Then we've got the marriage equality. That was a big sort of controversial thing. I remember that, yeah, was a big thing in 2014. That was granted for same-sex couples in Scotland, England, and Wales. But it actually wasn't until 2020 that it was granted in Northern Ireland. And that was actually voted on 5 times between 2012 and 15 and shot down quite a few times there. As of 2021, conversion therapy is still legal in the UK, and it has not been legislatively banned. Many people will say, that's fine, we don't actually have conversion therapy here in the UK, but I can tell you, in my experience, I have worked with people who have undergone conversion therapy in this modern era. It is something that is taking place, and until it is legislatively banned, it's something that will be really difficult to combat. Okay, fun times, lots of heavy stuff. So I'm going to now talk about transgender rights in the UK. And again, I'm going to start with the 70s. Grace just added, just a quick thing, you cannot be denied service or given poorer service. Yes, that's a really important point. You're also entitled to the same standards of education and healthcare. So those are really, really key. And as I say, we work with North and Norwich as well in sort of trying to make sure that people are aware of what is happening when it comes to different healthcare pathways for LGBT individuals. But yes, thank you very much for that, Grace. And if anyone wants to add to my things, please do. It's really, really important knowledge. So we've got transgender rights in the UK. I'm going to start in the 1970s, despite the fact that gender variant individuals are present throughout history, as are individuals with different sexualities. The reason there isn't a very easy to pick timeline of transgender individuals is basically because our understanding of sex, sexuality, and gender has changed so much over time. We used to think, for example, that gay men were women trapped in men's bodies. That's what a gay man was, according to early sexologists. So you can see that we now understand those to be two very separate identities, that of a gay man and that of a transgender woman. However, as I say, this was something that basically hasn't really been updated since then. So it's something that we're still sort of understanding and constantly evolving our understanding of sex and gender. For example, when it comes to biology, the discovery and understanding of different types of karyotypes. So, you know, we think of like XX and XY for chromosomes. Actually, there's up to 49 different variations of that. So even our understanding of sex can be a little outdated sometimes. Anyway, so we're going to start with Corbett versus Corbett, 1970s. April Ashley, model and actress, transitioned in 1960. So her and her husband basically go through a divorce. He files for a divorce on the basis that the court will consider Ashley to be male, even though her husband is well aware of her transition when they married. This is the basis that he files upon. The UK court then rules in his favour that she cannot legally change her sex, and the marriage itself was ruled unlawful, and she was one of the first transgender pioneers for marriage equality. You've then got 1980s to 1990s. The pressure group Press for Change campaigned in support for transgender people to be allowed to marry and to help take several cases to the European Court of Human Rights. Another notable case was Mark Griez versus the United Kingdom. The court deliberated for a long time, but it was decided the UK wasn't violating any human rights at this time. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the term transgender rose to popularity anyway, which replaced the sort of very medical term transsexual, as it includes all trans people, regardless of whether or not they have had gender affirmation surgery. And that kind of helps depathologize our existence. I'm transgender myself. Then we've got transgender rights in the UK. It's actually really interesting to note that it was Sweden in 1972 that was the first country in the world to allow trans people to legally change their sex. The second was China in 1974. My partner did point out to me that with Sweden, as they are Swedish, that actually this included sterilization. So transgender individuals must be, the population of transgender people must be sterilized in order to have these laws, which never sounds good en masse, does it? Then we've got the UK followed in 2004. However, it was only ruled after being asked to do so following an outcome of court ruling in favour of Goodwin and I versus the United Kingdom. And it was on the request of the EU Human Rights Commission. Christine Goodwin, she brought the case forward because she wasn't able to access her pension in the same age as other women. She couldn't marry, and she was facing long-term employment discrimination as a result of her transition. Interestingly, actually in June 2020, it was ranked one of the worst in Europe, the Gender Recognition Act. So it's found to lag behind international human rights standards. In September 2020, the government did publish the results of a public consultation into a reform of this act. It did show majority support for wide-ranging changes, making it much easier for individuals to access. However, none of these changes were made. What was made were some nominal procedural changes, which are still beneficial, such as moving it online and reducing the cost. However, it still remains quite an invasive and an inaccessible process for many people. In 2022, the term transgender is officially removed from the ICD-11 as a mental disorder. Does anyone want to have a guess at when you think homosexuality was removed by the World Health Organization? There are different dates for different organizations, but I'm specifically after who, also because it's been in the news so much, it's quite a good one. Just have a guess. Don't worry, it's not like I can remember all of these dates myself. Anyone want to have a guess in the chat box? 2010. That is a good guess. It is later than you think. So it was actually 1992. So it's 30 years prior, but still much later than you might imagine for homosexuality to not be considered a mental illness. Then we've got moving on to the rights of intersex people. Intersex individuals' experiences with gender are not the same as trans people's, though you can be trans and intersex. It's important to acknowledge that intersex issues aren't just an extension of transgender ones. Intersex people face a variety of challenges that differ greatly, although misunderstandings about gender and sex play a key role in both struggles. Intersex people are basically born with anatomical variations that mean their bodies don't conform to the recognized medical categories of male and female. There are, notably, roughly as many intersex people living in the UK as there are individuals with naturally red hair. And when it comes to intersex rights, there really aren't many. Unfortunately, intersex individuals are not considered under the Equality Act. They're not included under the Equality Act. And intersex surgeries still take place today, despite governmental insistence that they are a thing of the past. In fact, NHS data does show that surgeries on under 14s actually increased after 2006. And these are surgeries that take place on healthy individuals. The only reason they take place is because those individuals don't fit into the recognized sex categories that we expect people to have. So actually, our lack of tolerance for different gendered individuals can be quite harmful. So yeah, when it comes to gender variance and different sexualities, as I say, they're prevalent globally. They're evident in ancient civilizations and in indigenous cultures for thousands of years. In fact, it's European colonialism that was a major force in erasing the visibility of gender variant people in indigenous cultures throughout the world. And it's our inherited binary understanding of gender is in fact not what was in place for thousands of years, but it's a representation of that. The variety of gender expressions and identities available globally show people have rejected restrictive gender and sexuality systems throughout history as well as now. So it's really important that our current culture of acceptance is informed by the history that has come before us. I'm just going to leave you with a nice quote from Audre Lorde. When we speak, we're afraid that our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid, so it is better to speak.